Emily had always enjoyed quiet nights at home. She loved being alone in her apartment, with only the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. One evening the weather was especially bad, rain pounding against the windows, wind howling through the streets. Emily was sitting on the couch watching TV when she heard it, a knock at the door. She froze, her heart racing. It was well past midnight. Who could be at her door at this hour, especially in such a storm? She looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Puzzled, she tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just the wind. But then another knock. This time more urgent. A series of rapid, forceful knocks. Her heart raced even faster. She stepped back from the door and called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Curious, Emily approached the door again, peeking through the peephole once more. There was no one. But as she turned away, she heard something, whispers. They seemed to come from right outside her door. Her heart pounded in her chest. The whispers grew louder, but she couldn't make out the words. Without thinking, Emily grabbed her phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, the hallway was empty. No one was there. But the officers did find something strange, fresh, muddy footprints, leading to her door and then disappearing into the hallway. Emily moved out of the apartment a week later. But every night, she swears she still hears those knocks, and the whispers that follow. Ben lived in a small cabin far from the nearest town. It was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, just him and the peace of nature. One autumn evening, as a storm approached, Ben decided to take a walk in the woods. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the sky was an ominous shade of gray. As he ventured deeper into the woods, a feeling of unease started to settle in. The usual sounds of wildlife were missing. No birds, no rustling of animals. Just silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. But then he saw them. Glowing faintly in the dark, scattered throughout the trees, staring at him. His heart raced. He turned around, trying to make sense of what he saw, but when he looked back, the eyes were gone. Ben quickly began walking back to the cabin, but the deeper he went into the woods, the more he heard it, a soft rustling like footsteps following him. Panic set in. He ran, the wind howling in his ears, the storm chasing him. He made it back to the cabin, breathless, and locked the door behind him. That night, as the storm raged outside, Ben sat by the window watching the trees sway. And that's when he saw it again, eyes, glowing faintly through the rain and darkness just outside the cabin. Watching him. Ben never returned to those woods. No one ever found out who, or what, those eyes belonged to. Alice had just moved into her new apartment. It was an old building with creaky floors and windows that never quite closed properly. One evening after a long day, Alice decided to take a hot bath. The water was soothing, the room filled with steam, and Alice closed her eyes, letting herself relax. But as she did, she noticed something strange in the bathroom mirror. A figure. It was faint at first, almost like a shadow, but as the steam cleared, the reflection became clearer. Alice gasped. It was her own reflection, except her reflection wasn't moving. It stood still, staring back at her with empty eyes. She turned around quickly, but no one was there. The room was still. Terrified, Alice checked every corner of the apartment, but found nothing. She tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just the steam playing tricks on her. But every night after that, the reflection returned, still staring at her. She contacted the landlord, asking if anyone else had reported strange occurrences in the building. The landlord hesitated before replying, "You're not the first. There's an old story about a woman who lived there, A woman who disappeared without a trace, but her reflection, it stayed. It's said to appear to those who live in the apartment now as a reminder. Alice never slept in that apartment again. John was working late at the office. It was already past midnight, and the only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights above and the clacking of his keyboard. He had been staring at the same report for hours when suddenly his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, no caller ID. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him pick it up. "Hello," he said, his voice tired. There was a long silence before a voice crackled through the phone. "John, are you still working?" John froze. The voice sounded familiar. It was his mother's voice, but something was off. It was distant, broken, almost as if the call was coming from far away. "Mom? What's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "You're working too late, John. You need to come home." Her voice was soft yet firm. Confused and unsettled, John looked at the time. His mother had passed away a year ago. He hadn't heard from her since the funeral. His heart began to pound as the call disconnected abruptly. John checked his phone. The call log showed no record of the call. The next morning, his co-workers found him slumped over his desk. His phone was in his hand, the screen cracked. He had been listening to nothing but static when he passed away. No one could explain the phone call he received the night before. Rachel had lived in her family's old house for years. It was a large, century-old building with creaky floors and rooms that seemed to shift and change at night. One evening when she was home alone, Rachel heard a strange thumping noise coming from the attic. At first she thought it was just the house settling, but as the noise grew louder, Rachel's curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way up to the attic. As she reached the top, a cold, musty air hit her. The attic was dark, cluttered with old boxes and furniture, but there was something else, a figure. It was sitting in an old chair in the corner, hunched over. Its head was bowed and it didn't move. Rachel called out, "Who's there?" The figure remained silent. Slowly she approached it, her flashlight shaking in her hand. As she got closer, she saw it, pale skin covered in dirt and grime, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. Rachel screamed and ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind her. She never told anyone what she saw that night. But every now and then she hears faint tapping on the attic door, and sometimes she feels the eyes watching her from the darkness above. And so we end tonight's tales, 5 true stories of people who found themselves alone, only to realize that the dark corners of their world were far from empty. Whether it's the knock at the door, the eyes in the woods, or the shadow that lingers in the attic, remember, there are things out there that we cannot explain. Things that watch us from the dark. Thank you for listening. Sleep well if you can, and may your night remain undisturbed by what waits in the shadows.